and we're looking at these amendments and obviously to try and avert illegal strike action that has crippled especially a lot of the resource companies. There is a concern that this could lead to job cuts. Tell us how so.
Well, the big concern is really that the current wage levels are already pretty high compared to most of our international trading partners, and productivity levels haven't really kept up. So what happens now with the amendments is that after 6 months, you have a situation where temporary workers' wages and remuneration would be comparable to those of permanent workers, and that would have an increase of between 20 and 30% of the actual cost of employment. Obviously, the impact of that is significant given the current labour market.
So, John, we're actually looking at the cost of employment more than anything that could actually be affected, but surely the amendments that will come to the fore are going to be very cognizant on ensuring that it doesn't affect the job scenario in the country. Surely government is very cognizant of that.
Yeah, government as a whole are. We have Minister Patel and Treasury Minister Gordon specifically looking at initiatives around youth employment subsidies and national development plans, a new growth path. But it does appear that the Department of Labour as a division or department within government, as a ministry within government, seems to be ticking against that particular trend. And, I think we can all appreciate that equal pay in an ideal environment would be the best scenario. But currently we've got what's called the labour market elasticity ratio of 0.7%, which really means that for each 1% increase in the cost of employment, there's a 0.7% decrease in the number of people employed. So, if there is an increase in costs of, say, 20% of the cost of employing people, you could very well find unemployment increasing by between 10 and 13% for temporary workers.
Okay, looking at the draft legislation, and as you mentioned earlier, it is about employing people on a permanent basis. This is obviously going to create the lack of flexibility to adapt to various market conditions. Should we see another recession, for example, hitting the country, is this just not going to make business a whole lot leaner and ensuring they do take a lot of wise decisions before they embark on, hiring people on a permanent basis?
Absolutely. The unfortunate thing is, and we've seen it already happening in a number of the clients of labour brokers, for example, and also companies that employ temporary workers directly. They're looking definitely at automation, new technologies, mechanisation, and in a number of cases even offshoring to India and other countries. So unfortunately, I think this was the tipping point. We already had a very tight environment. You take that flexibility and the cost flexibility away, and I think it's a recipe for disaster.
What about the new equal pay requirements in the bill? How is this going to change things? John, if you could add more light to that, please.
Yeah, look, the reality is we certainly don't oppose as business. We wouldn't oppose equal pay insofar as it's related to gender, sex, sexual orientation, race, and all those things. The problem with the proposed legislation is that it stretches equal pay beyond discriminatory matters to literally where one employee can compare him or herself to a colleague, and there might be very good economic rationale and supply and demand drivers that differentiate in pay. But now suddenly, any man and his dog can compare his income comparative to another person, and the consequences of that are significant. Companies are going to have to litigate a heck of a lot. The attorneys, I think, will be the ones getting very rich in this particular process. It creates uncertainty in the business environment, and of course, along with a whole lot of other regulatory changes, doesn't bode well for business.
What about the point on labour broking? We've got to keep in mind that it still needs to go to public hearings and also needs to go through to Parliament. So perhaps this is just the draft, as we mentioned.
I don't believe it's a draft. Technically it is a draft, but indications are that they will be definitely channeled through Parliament without any significant changes. And we have that on pretty good authority. So, I think what currently is in the bills, I don't see much chance of that changing. As I say, a business could probably live with most of the changes. The big issue is the issue around equal pay for work of equal value. And the reason it's a problem is that we already have minimum wages in many sectors, like bargaining councils have got minimum wages that have been negotiated by the bilateral parties, employers and unions. So in our view, if you're paying the minimum wage, then that should be sufficient. You know, the argument that it's not a decent wage if it's not comparable doesn't stand, because if unions agreed to those wages in the first instance, well then surely if we pay people the minimum wage, it should be sufficient. And collective bargaining is the methodology to raise wages in terms above minimums. And it's almost as if the Department of Labour are now stepping in the employer-employee domain and almost undermining collective bargaining by setting higher than minimum comparatives. So it's a huge concern, because it also strikes at the heart of the whole labour relations system, which is collective bargaining focused.